So, have you seen this CNN interview with Tim Dillon? It definitely makes you stop and think, asking if he's part of a new establishment.
Oh, yeah. It definitely grabbed attention, didn't it? That whole sit-down, Elle Reeve from CNN and Tim Dillon, the comedian with the big podcast, the Netflix special. It feels like a real snapshot of where media is right now.
Totally. And that central question Elle Reeve asked him, do you think you are part of a new establishment? That's really what we're digging into today. We've got the interview itself, obviously, but also some pretty sharp takes on the interview from other commentators.
Right.
And our goal isn't just to, rehash it. It's more about using this whole exchange as a lens, to understand the bigger picture of mainstream media versus these, alternative platforms like podcasts.
Yeah, see how they interact. Or maybe how they don't interact effectively sometimes.
Exactly. Was Reeve's approach actually effective? What does Dillon's side tell us about this whole shifting landscape? Let's get into it.
Okay, so let's start right there with that big question, the new establishment thing. Dillon's reaction was, pretty much what you'd expect from him, right?
He laughed it off, basically.
Yeah. He found it, absurd that a few comedians with microphones could possibly have more real power than, billionaires, huge media corporations, political parties. He even kind of suggested it's a convenient story, maybe an excuse for running unpopular candidates or something.
It's interesting you say that because Breaking Point's jumped on this too. Their take was, okay, maybe podcasters aren't the political establishment, not in the old school sense.
Right, not making laws.
But because trust in those old institutions has dropped so much. And they brought up, 9/11, the wars, Bernie Sanders, the Hunter Biden laptop thing, COVID origins, all that stuff.
All the big trust-eroding moments.
Exactly. People are now valuing these podcast voices more. They're turning to them for maybe a different perspective.
So it's a shift in influence, not necessarily formal power. It's about who commands attention and maybe shapes the conversation now.
And Breaking Points also threw in that idea of a kind of want-to-be new elite around Trump. Adds another layer, doesn't it? It's not just one monolithic establishment.
No, definitely not. And established power, let's be honest, often has roots across both parties anyway. It's complicated.
Dillon himself made a key distinction, though. He talked about the sheer size of his audience versus, actual institutional power. Government, legacy media.
Millions of listeners is one thing.
Yeah, but it's not the same as controlling policy or, the New York Times' front page. Big difference.
Which kind of naturally leads us into the whole critique of mainstream media that bubbled up around this interview, both from Dillon and the reactions after.
Yeah, right from the start, it felt like CNN was maybe a bit unsure how to handle him, or perhaps came in with an agenda.
Well, Comedy Enforcement pointed out that Dillon seemed hesitant to even do the interview, and then CNN apparently held back the full, longer version for a while.
Implying they were maybe fishing, looking for a specific clip, a gotcha moment.
That was the suggestion, not necessarily a genuine, open conversation. And Comedy Enforcement also floated the idea that it was maybe an indirect way to go after Joe Rogan.
Because they couldn't get Rogan himself. So try to understand his orbit, or maybe frame it through someone like Dillon.
That's the theory. Whether it's true, who knows? But it speaks to the perception.
And the interview itself, a lot of people found it, awkward.
Understatement, maybe. The Snarky AI piece described Elle Reeve as sounding, genuinely confused sometimes, maybe a bit out of her depth with Dillon's style.
Yeah, not exactly the sharp, probing questions you might anticipate in that setting.
And that confusion really came to a head, I think, with that whole segment on left-wing comedians.
Oh, that was something else. Reeve seemed genuinely stumped, like she couldn't think of any prominent ones.
Which, for someone in her position, feels like a pretty big gap in knowledge, right?
Huge. Dillon just starts rattling them off. Chelsea Handler, John Mulaney, Sarah Silverman, Bill Burr, Louis C.K.,
Trevor Noah, Amy Schumer, Michelle Wolf.
Samantha Bee, Ollie Wong.
Yeah.
He just kept going.
And when Reeve tried to counter with, canceled shows, Dillon just shot that down. Said, that doesn't mean they aren't successful or influential.
Ooh, JP Reacts didn't mince words, said Dillon torched her on that. It was just a really noticeable moment.
It really was. It kind of highlighted this potential disconnect, maybe a bubble within some parts of mainstream media, a skewed view of the wider cultural scene.
And the online reactions seemed to reflect that perception. You had JP Reacts calling Reeve a CNN nitwit, which is harsh, but...
And this Snarky AI calling the whole thing a humiliating train wreck for CNN. I mean, the commentary was brutal.
It all feeds this larger narrative, doesn't it? That traditional media is losing its grip because people are actively looking elsewhere to platforms they feel are maybe more direct or truthful.
Both JP Reacts and Breaking Points hit on that theme. People voting with their attention spans.
And Breaking Points had an interesting point about the different pressures, right?
Yep.
Corporate media having, corporate bosses, bottom lines, maintaining access.
Versus new media, which is more about direct audience capture. And maybe advertisers who are more aligned with a specific creator or show. Different incentives entirely.
So given all that, let's focus a bit more on Elle Reeve's role here. How did her approach as the interviewer come across, especially considering the reactions?
Well, starting with the core question, the new establishment framing. As we said, it felt a bit simplistic, maybe missing the layers of how influence actually works now.
Yeah, not quite hitting the mark.
And then the questions about Rogan. Comedy Enforcement highlighted this idea of her suggesting comedians might be somehow controlled by him.
Which Dillion just laughed at, like completely dismissed it as absurd.
Right. It showed a potential misunderstanding of how that whole podcasting sphere operates. It's not some top-down hierarchy.
And going back to it, the apparent blank on major left-wing comedians, that's a significant oversight if you're trying to analyze the cultural landscape, isn't it?
Absolutely. It suggests maybe a limited frame of reference or perhaps just not being prepared for that specific line of discussion.
Then there was the attempt, as Comedy Enforcement described it, to build this narrative around Rogan's influence based on, what? Vibes. A club feeling.
Yeah, it felt less about concrete political alignment and more about these sort of vague, hard-to-pin-down ideas, not very substantive.
It was also noticeable that she did bring up Dillon having people like Steve Bannon or J.D. Vance on his show.
Right, she raised the topic.
But then it just kind of fizzled. There wasn't much of a deep dive or real critical pushback on their views. It felt like a box check, then moved on.
Yeah, a missed opportunity maybe to have a more robust exchange there.
Yeah.
Which contributes to the overall feeling many had that the interview felt awkward and lacked those really sharp, insightful follow-ups.
That line from the Snarky AI really stuck with me. CNN interviewing Tim Dillon like he's the vice president to the Joe Rogan Experience.
Oof. Yeah, that kind of sums up the feeling that the focus was maybe misplaced.
What about the part where they talked about politicians going on podcasts? Dillon had a pretty, let's say, cynical view.
Yeah, very much so. His take was basically everyone's got an agenda, politicians included. No surprises there for him.
He didn't seem to think interviewing them was inherently bad, though. His point was more about, you have to be willing to call them out if they contradict themselves or act against what they say.
Hold them accountable, which is fair. And Breaking Plates chimed in here, too, saying that nowadays, politicians almost have to use podcasts. It's a key way to reach certain audiences they might otherwise miss.
And maybe those longer, less edited podcast formats do offer something different. You potentially see a side of people you don't get in a quick TV hit.
Could be. It allows for more rambling, more tangents, which can be revealing in itself, for better or worse.
There were a couple of those specific moments in the interview that really jumped out in the commentary, too, like the story Reeve told.
Oh, the manager story.
Yeah.
Some comedian's manager supposedly told her they couldn't do an interview because Rogan would be mad.
Dillon's reaction was pure disbelief. And Comedy Enforcement basically said, yeah, that sounds pretty ridiculous. Hard to imagine that actually being the reason.
Right. And then the quick bit about Steve Bannon and the alleged Roman salute.
Dillon's take was interesting. He figured it was probably Bannon trolling or just being awkward rather than some serious ideological signal.
Just trying to provoke a reaction, maybe. And then the J.D. Vance thing, the comment about Kamala Harris being a fun drunk.
Dillon immediately called it out as a pre-planned line, a canned bit.
Yeah, which gives you a little peek behind the curtain, right? Even in these supposedly looser podcast settings, the political messaging is still very much there.
So finally, the reaction to the interview itself seems pretty significant. CNN did eventually release the whole thing.
Yep, despite maybe hesitating at first.
Yeah.
And the Snarky AI loved pointing out that it got massively ratioed online.
Meaning way more negative comments and replies than likes or positive engagement?
Exactly. And just generally, the online vibe seemed pretty pro-Dillon in how he handled it, and quite critical of CNN's whole approach. That seemed to be the consensus in the commentary we looked at.
Which maybe says something about audiences, right? They're paying attention, they're critiquing the media they consume, even mainstream sources. They notice when an approach feels off or ineffective.
Definitely suggests a more engaged, maybe more skeptical audience,
Yeah.
especially online. The fact that it generated so much discussion underlines these shifts we've been talking about.
Okay, so wrapping this up, the key takeaways seem pretty clear. This CNN interview, and especially the reactions to it, really put a spotlight on this perceived gap, a gap between how some mainstream outlets see the world and the reality of the current media landscape, particularly the power and style of platforms like podcasts.
Yeah, the interview kind of unintentionally became this case study. It showed some of the dynamics of these newer platforms, but also maybe some of the ways legacy media struggles to engage effectively.
And for you listening, hopefully this deep dive gave you a good, quick overview of these different angles, maybe a few aha moments about how media power might be shifting. It really drives home why it's so important to, look at all media critically and try to get perspectives from different places.
Absolutely. It's about piecing together a fuller picture.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. As traditional media keeps trying to figure out this new terrain, how do you think platforms like podcasts are going to keep evolving? How will they keep shaping, public conversation?
And importantly, what kind of responsibility comes with that growing influence? Do these new platforms have a role in holding power accountable? And if so, what does that look like? Something to chew on.